All right, good. She's in. Okay, so I think we'll get started. And because this is only going to be 1 hour, not an hour and a half like Torah study is, and this is going to be a little different than Torah study, most specifically because of the material that we're learning. And just really glad to have everyone here. I just want to point out to you a few things. So number one is that I am recording the class. So just be aware that the class is recorded. And it's available if you want to go back, see it or whatever. It'll be on our website. We may stick it on our YouTube channel as well. Also, I just want to point out to you that we are going to be meeting, excuse me, at this time and on this day and at this time for the next month. So for all of January, we'll meet on Wednesdays at 11 a.m. In February, I'm going to move it to maybe not Wednesdays, it might be Tuesday evenings. And I'm going to do it for a month on Tuesday evenings. And based upon, who comes and, the interest in it, then I'm going to make a decision whether to then do it during the daytimes or the evenings moving forward. So, and certainly the number of people who are here right now communicates that this is a relatively convenient time, but I just don't want to, I want to just be open to the possibility that some people would like to be here, but middle of the day is hard. So, but then again, for some of you, you might say, yeah, but Tuesday evenings are more complicated for me. So again, we'll see. But I just want you to know that in February, we're going to try it for a month in the evenings, and then March, we will then make a determination of when the future will be. Okay. So let me just want to do one more thing before I forget, and that is I wanted to take a picture of the people who are here, but I now can't find it on I thought I had it, a clip or something like that. Oh, well, can't find it. So I thought I used to have it, but now it's gone. Just take a picture of the screen. So, all right, so what we're going to do is study something called Pirkei Avot. So before we study Pirkei Avot, though, I think I need to kind of give you an understanding of what exactly it is that we're talking about when I say Pirkei Avot. So let me begin by just taking you on a little bit of a journey on my favorite website in the entire world called Sefaria. So Sefaria is a website which just has like every single Jewish text on the planet. I mean, this is what their homepage. Oh well, I'm having some problems here. All right, well, anyway, and by the way, I want you to know, since I'm in my basement, I'm having a little bit of bandwidth issues. So if I get choppy or even if I get cut off, know that I'm just going to hustle my way and get back to you as soon as I can. By the way, Mary, I see you have a hand up. Do you have a question to ask at first, or?
Yes, you said in February we'd meet on Tuesday evenings. The evening of the board meeting, are we skipping class or changing the time?
Probably. I'm not exactly sure. I haven't even looked at the dates yet. Okay. So you're on, as you can see, you're on just the text page of a website called Sefaria. And this page just has various different remarkable, I mean, if you can look, they've got texts on Tanakh, which is the Bible, and it has Mishnah, which is a Jewish text. I'll talk about a second. Talmud, a Jewish text. Midrash text. Halakha, works of law. Kabbalah, which is works of mysticism. Liturgy, which is our prayer service. Jewish thought. So again, and there's all sorts of extraordinary material here. So, but let's just focus on these top four for a moment. Tanakh, which is the Jewish Bible. Midrash, which is storytelling, but also, storytelling and about our sages. And then the Talmud and the Mishnah. So the Talmud is, when I click on it, you can see it's a corpus of literature, which includes all these what are called tractates of the Talmud. And you can see there are many. And each one of these tractates is composed of what's called the Mishnah and the Gemara. And the Mishnah is like the earliest legal conversation we had, and the Gemara is the discussion of that conversation. Now, so which leads me to, let me just walk over to the Mishnah here. And by the way, their description of it is generations of rabbinic debate about law, ethics, and Bible structured as commentary on the Mishnah with stories interwoven. Now, the Mishnah is the core, is the kernel of the Talmud, and it's described first major work of rabbinic literature compiled around 200 CE, documenting a multiplicity of legal opinions in the oral tradition. So as we click on it, you will see that there are various different books of the Mishnah. Most of them have a book of Talmud associated with it. But one of the books of the Mishnah that doesn't have a book of Talmud associated with it, well, not exactly, and we can talk about it later, is one of them called Pirkei Avot. And those are short statements of advice, ethics, and wisdom. And when you click on Pirkei Avot, you can see that it has 6 chapters, of which we are currently I Xerox chapter 1, and we're not even going to get to, we're just going to do a couple of the sayings. We're not even going to get close to finishing a chapter today. But one thing is interesting about it is that just for the future, if you choose to go to Sefaria, if you click on the first one, let's say, you have the references available to you, 144 commentaries on this one Mishnah. Not all of them are in English, unfortunately. So you have to, find the ones that have the word English next to it. But it just goes to show just how much they've been talked about, thought about, and discussed. So I'm going to stop sharing at this point. And I thought we would do is start looking at the first one. Now, before we do it, I do want to say one more thing, which is that my goal or my plan in discussing this is for us to actually, one more request of you all, please. Could you please, in the chat of this, I don't know if you know how to do a chat, but if you just scroll, you put your mouse over, and if you're on an iPad, you might have to, it's probably the 3 dots, but you click on the button chat. And if you wouldn't mind, if you could just type in your name, just so I have a list of the people who came. So just type in your name in the chat. That'd be very helpful for me. I really appreciate it. If there are 2 of you, put both of your names down. And again, if you're on an iPad, I think you have to click the 3 dots. I'm not exactly positive. So, by the way, someone asked in the chat, I was looking at it, is Sefaria do we know who wrote Sefaria, and is it trustworthy? And the answer is it's very trustworthy. It's very, very, very trustworthy, and it's a very objective thing. It's just the texts and then cross-referencing of texts. Now, granted, people have the capacity to write opinions about these texts in something called sheets that are on it, and then that becomes an opinion and not just an objective text. But Safari is 100% trustworthy and an extraordinary resource. Now, my goal and my plan for this discussion is for us to read each one of these parecs, each one of these sayings, and that will be meaningful, and discuss it as much as you want to, and tease out the values and ethics that come from these sayings. However, it's also to go a little bit deeper into the person who wrote it or who said it, and maybe understand a little bit more about those people, and understand a little bit more about, why it was that they said that, if we can figure it out, if I can figure it out. And for that matter, enable us to dive more deeply into the world of these sages. You see, the writings, the Talmud and our rabbinic literature is divided into, it's over a period of 500 years. And so therefore, the people who wrote in the same, the people who wrote in the first years of our rabbinic literature, and the people who wrote in the last years of our rabbinic literature were separated by half a millennium. So the earliest people are the ones who wrote these. These are our earliest sages. They are referred to as the Tanaim, Tannaim, because that's plural. You got a Tana, Tanna, and then the im makes it plural. So the Tanaim are our earliest sages. And in fact, at least the ones we're going to be doing today. After the ones we do today, it'll be different. But the ones we're doing today are the earliest ones. So we're talking about, these were written, or these people lived in the 3rd century BCE, which is before, remember, the temple was destroyed. So I'm just trying to give you a little sense of the timing of these. So we're going to read the first one. And so hopefully everyone has a copy of the document. And this is, on top it should say Pirkei Avot, chapter 1. And we're going to look at the first one. And again, the plan is to understand it, talk about the values, but also to talk about, why it may have been written like it was, and what was its purpose and what was the goal. And again, who knows how much of this we'll get through. Our plan is to go from 11 to 12, which gives you a nice opportunity to have lunch. Okay, so the first one, would anyone be interested in reading the first parak, the first one we have, Pirkei Avot 1, on the first page. Anybody want to read? Mary, go ahead.
Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. They said 3 things. Be patient in the administration.
It's Paul. It's Paul. Thanks for the information I got on Zoom.
Okay, keep going.
They said 3 things. Be patient in the administration of justice, raise many disciples, and make a fence around the Torah.
All right, thank you so much. Before we start unpacking it, does anybody have any initial thoughts about what we just read? And again, the good news about this is that whereas so much of Jewish law, Jewish writing and rabbinic texts can be so esoteric and so complicated and so distant. Here, I'm gonna mute everybody, and you're welcome to unmute yourself when you choose. Okay, so a lot of this can be so esoteric and distant and just so it's so unwielding almost. The best part about Pirkei Avot is that every part of it, it's very accessible. It's very accessible. So initial thoughts. Looks like Bob and Cookie, you've got a thought.
I'm sorry. My initial thought is that we talk about the fence. It seems to be that what the Orthodox talk about fencing around everything that we do, and as a consequence, we've kind of this is not in the Torah, but it was commentary, and it kind of extended today in such a way that we have all these barriers around things that we do, and I find it a little bit difficult to accept based upon something somebody said almost 2,000 years ago, without any basis in the Torah, which I personally look at as kind of as our constitution for the Jewish people as a basis for which we act. Okay, and that's my sense of it, and I understand it because we want to make sure that the community at that time the community stayed within the parameters that were just described. But today we've carried in the last 500 or 1,000 years we've carried a little bit far, in my sense. And that's just my initial thought with it. Otherwise, the remainder of it is certainly is acceptable.
Yep. Thank you. Laura? Unmute, Laura. Unmute. I muted everybody.
Sorry about that. The terminology "make a fence around the Torah" I found so lovely, and I took it as be protective of the Torah and the teachings. That's how I took it.
It is. It's meant to be protective, right? The fence around the Torah is not meant to be understood as like keeping people out, but rather it's meant so how do I put it? So
Keep
if
people
you
in.
The best example of keeping people in, but also it's communicating that we're gonna create rules which are gonna be beyond the Torah as a way of preventing people from violating the Torah. So in other words, it's saying, like, if you don't want someone to step on the grass of your property, don't just have a fence right at the grass point, which almost entices people to jump over the fence and potentially step on the grass. Instead, build that fence 100 feet beyond the grass so that if someone were to jump the fence, they would still have to go 100 feet in order to step on the grass. That is building a fence around the Torah. So if the Torah says, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk, then building a fence would say, let's make eating all milk and meat, in fact, even mixing all chicken and milk, let's make that the law, that you can't mix chicken and milk, as not because the Torah has a problem with chicken and milk, but rather because we are going to build a fence around it such that we're going to ensure no one violates the law of cooking a kid in its mother's milk, because we're even outlawing chicken and milk mixed together. That's what building a fence is around the Torah. But nonetheless, other thoughts before we go into, I mean, I don't mind going into the details right away, but just other thoughts about this.
Yes. Yeah. Where it says raise many disciples, is this one of the reasons that Orthodox have many children? Or why does it could also be interpreted as get a lot of converts, and yet in practice the Jewish religion doesn't encourage proselytizing.
It's a good question. I see it as education, and I see it as students, not as and it's disciples is a bad translation. It's students. The Hebrew says V'ha'amidu. And by the way, one of the great things about Pirkei Avot is it's all Hebrew. The Talmud is all written in Aramaic. This is Hebrew, which makes it so much easier. Anyway, it says V'ha'amidu talmidim harbeh. Talmidim is a student, to raise up many students. So in other words, to teach this stuff to lots of people. So I'll tell you what, why don't we
Rabbi,
piece by piece.
could you just refresh my memory? What, out of matter of fact here, what is the Great Assembly?
We'll get there. Good question. Don't worry, I'm on that. I'm on it. Okay, so why don't we start from the beginning? Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets, prophets to the Great Assembly. So if you stop there, remember, this is the first ethical statement of this book. So what is that first ethical statement? We care about our past. We care about our history. We care about a chain of tradition and transmission. We care about people who came before us. That certainly is a, is a meaningful value. And then, so it's, so it says Moses received the Torah at Sinai. So that's an important first step, right? That the Torah that we have, where does it come from? God. Now, we may agree or disagree with that statement, and I'm not saying, and I'm not making a judgment about historicity or authenticity, or, but what I can't deny is Pirkei Avot is about as clear as can be, in which it says, hey, the Torah that we have comes from God. God gave it to Moses. Moses gave it to Joshua. Joshua gave it to the elders. So who were the elders? Okay, they were probably the ones who were living in Canaan after during the after Moses, when we conquered Canaan. And then it goes on. It says the elders gave it to the prophets. So in other words, oh my God, have I frozen? Okay, good, you're there. The elders gave it to the prophets. In other words, the prophets are also as they are equally they have the words that they communicated were equally as meaningful and as holy. By the way, I feel like, and I told you about my bandwidth issues, I feel like I see people who are frozen, and so therefore it could be me. Are you having a hard time hearing me?
No, I hear you loud and clear, Rabbi.
Okay, good, just checking. Thank you for telling me. Okay, so it continues. The prophets gave it to the men of the Great Assembly. So who were the men of the Great Assembly? Well, we're going to have a chance to read about them later too. But what I will say is that the men of the Great Assembly were here. Actually, what I can do is share my. Pardon me for 1.5 seconds. As a material. There we go. Okay. What do you know? So this guy Bartanura, who was a commentator on Pirkei Avot. Now again, he's commenting on a different one, but it doesn't matter. No, to the men of the Great Assembly, he said there were 120 elders, including Zerubbabel, Sariah, Realiah, Mordechai, Bilshan, who in the days of Ezra were the ones who emigrated from the diaspora in the period of the Second Temple. Included among them were Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, Nehemiah ben Chaliah, and their associates, and they were called the Great Assembly since they restored the crown to its original splendor. So, in other words, what they're communicating as the men of the Great Assembly, they're saying that it is the people who came, or some people who came around the time of Ezra, when he came back after the Babylonian/Persian exile, returned to Israel and rebuilt the temple. And that, so at the beginning of the time of the Second Temple, that was when the leaders, the men of the Great Assembly, lived. So I see Bob and Laura have hands up, but it could be from before. So are you guys have new stuff or is this old stuff? A new question or old question?
Mine is from before, I'm sorry.
Oh,
Ours is from before
Okay.
as well.
So if you can lower, it's great, no problem. All right, so so they said three things, these men of the Great Assembly. And we know, so the first thing they say is be patient in the administration of justice. Anybody have a thought about what does that mean? You know, it doesn't say don't judge. It doesn't say you can't have an opinion. Rather, they say do it carefully.
You're not muted.
So one of the first values of our people is to be,
Yes, well, Rabbi,
Yeah.
the 10 Commandments, at least 7 of the 10, basically are about justice.
okay. So it does, but right. So it's about how you do justice and not about the concept of justice. In other words, what it's saying is you need to be patient, you need to be careful, you need to be moderate. Don't rush to judgments or don't assume things. Don't assume that you've done this 100 times and you don't need to and you don't need to think about each case individually. Be patient, be thoughtful about justice.
Investigate.
Oh, Eleanor, go ahead.
Investigate.
Investigate, yeah.
much in the same sense that we have a judicial system and over the period of years where we investigate, not only investigate, but make sure that we have all the facts before we rush to judgment. I think that's one of the major ideas, and that carries over till today, in theory anyway.
But in some situations, it's very simple. If somebody steals another's goat, then that's clear cut. Don't steal. And he stole the goat.
Right.
But it requires evidence that he did so, rather than if he's seen and you have some witnesses that will say, but you don't assume because it's something.
The witnesses are the ones that were invited to dinner after he slaughtered the goat and made a big feast.
But maybe he thought it was his goat. It looks like his.
And he may have made a mistake. We don't know. But before you rush to justice and say if you stole the goat, you may have,
That's right.
or you may have bought it from some third party. We don't know. So that's what I'm saying. That's why if you bought stolen property, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're guilty of theft. And if you had no knowledge of it, you may not be guilty of receiving stolen property. That's the whole idea. So don't rush to justice assuming that somebody stole the goat because they have the goat or have the goat meat.
Yep. Okay, so so piece number one is, okay, sorry, would you like to say something?
Yes.
Jim, go ahead.
The people identified are political leaders and prophets who may be legislators. Aaron and the priests are not mentioned as those to whom the Torah was transmitted. So the prophets and other people who legislate, that is, administrate justice, Moses being the first.
Correct. But and so maybe, and what's happening, and again, while it's true that some of the earliest people that are being referred to, and maybe we'll get to them a little bit later today, while it is true that they lived at the time of, in the 3rd century or 2nd century, and while it is true that the men of the Great Assembly spoken of here were in the 4th century, the people who are writing this are people who are writing this in, hundreds of years later, probably this is probably being written in the 2nd century CE. Now, some of the things that, some of the people and the comments by people will be will be very close to around the time that it was written. But these earlier ones are referring to times and periods which were a number of centuries prior to when it was written. Nonetheless, the first, and that is important because yes, so when it has to do with justice and being patient with justice, that we have to, that they might be making a statement about a previous time, or they might be making a statement about their current time. Now, so and the best way of looking at it is raise many disciples. We talked about it for a moment, but let's talk about it a little bit more. Raise many disciples, educate the youth, have a lot of students, seems like a lovely value, to be sure. However, it becomes even more interesting when kind of perhaps put into the context of, are they commenting about something? So for example, let's take the priesthood. What do we know about the priests during the time that the temple stood? Or better yet, what do we know about how you become a priest? There's a famous joke.
It's hereditary.
Right, it's a famous joke about the guy who goes to his rabbi and says, "Rabbi, look, I want you to make me a Kohen." And the rabbi says, "I don't know if I can do that." And the guy says, "Rabbi, look, I will do anything. I will make a contribution to the temple of $1 million if you would simply make me a Kohen." And the rabbi's like, "Look, I would love to make you a Kohen, and surely you should know that our synagogue could use that gift. But I have to tell you, it's not the way it works. I can't just make you a Kohen. But tell me something. Why is it that you want to be a Kohen so bad?" And the guy says, "I want to be a Kohen because, my dad was a Kohen, my grandfather was a Kohen, my great-grandfather was a Kohen. I want to be a Kohen too," right? And the reason why it's a joke is because you're a Kohen.
Yeah.
Because it's hereditary, right? And he said, so number one, raise many disciples. It could very well be is communicating at an early stage, which is, hey, to be to kind of devote yourself to Judaism and to devote yourself to Jewish traditions is not something reserved for people of a specific family. Raise many disciples. Anyone who is interested, bring them on.
But they have to be boys.
Yes. Not anymore, but yes, back then. And it says Talmidim. It's, specifically the masculine ending. Now, there are, however, it could also be a comment about something that was going on in roughly their time period. So for example, let's take a look at brachot. This is a page of Talmud And by the way, when it has bold, that's the actual words of the Talmud. When it's regular type, it is, I think it's Sonsino, maybe some help, to help understand what it's saying. So from Brach, now this, I didn't give you the whole story. The context of this is that this guy named Rabban Gamliel, who was the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin, the rabbinic council, he and law group, he had been impeached because he was functioning in a way which was, I don't know, I don't want to go into all the details, but he just was acting in a way which was, he embarrassed people, and he just wasn't being a kind leader of the rabbinic council. And so after he had been impeached, they came up with a replacement for him. And the replacement's name was Rabbi Elazar, but doesn't matter, because it says it was taught on that day that they removed Rabban Gamliel from his position and appointed Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah in his place. There was also a fundamental change in the general approach to the study hall, as they dismissed the guard at the door and permission was granted to the students to enter. Instead of Rabban Gamliel's selective approach that asserted that the students must be screened before accepting them into the study hall, the new approach asserted that anyone who seeks to study should be given the opportunity to do so. As Rabban Gamliel would proclaim and say, any student whose inside are not like his outside, he will not enter the study hall. In other words, maybe that Pirkei Avot saying, raise many students, is a way of saying, unlike Gamliel, who would turn people away unless they met a certain status or stature or pedigree, anyone can study and be a Torah scholar. And another famous person you may have heard of, Shammai, as in Hillel and Shammai. This comes from the Midrash Avot Rabbi Natan. It says, and he's referencing this very thing that we're talking about, and raise up many students. He said, for the house of Shammai, they would say one should teach only a person who is wise, humble, of good pedigree, and rich. But the house of Hillel say, teach everyone, for there were many sinners in Israel, and they were brought close to Torah study, and they came out righteous, kind, and proper. In other words, one of the reasons why perhaps this first statement was made about raising many students is because they're trying to separate themselves from other ones of the sages who they disagreed with when they would make studying Torah a very specific and unique and only a select or elite group were able to do so. So let's see. So I guess one last thing I want to just kind of communicate about this is the bigger point that they're trying to make here. And again, since we don't really have too many people's names, I couldn't really go into detail about the individual who was saying these. This one, as you can see, is an anonymous source, but they are making a very important claim here, which is about the notion that the Torah and what is interpreted by the rabbis, called the oral Torah, are equal. So let me say that differently. So in Jewish tradition, in Orthodox Jewish tradition, we have something called Torah shebichtiv, the Torah that was written down. And also we have something called Torah shebal peh, Torah that was oral, the oral tradition. And according to Orthodox Judaism, the Torah that was given by the rabbis of this period is as holy, as sacred as the Torah that they perceive as having been given by God on Mount Sinai. And so they're saying there are two Torahs that are just as equal. One is the Torah, and one is the Torah that we created that came from the words of the Torah. One's the oral Torah, one is the written Torah. And what they are communicating is, look, it started from Moses and it ended and it's now, in our hands. And as a result, and it's all part of the same chain. It's all part of the same electrical circuit. So let me just show you one other comment or one other story about that. It's a beautiful story. I love the story. From the Talmud, from something called Menachot. And it says, Rav Yehuda says, that Rav says. So Yehuda is quoting Rav, and he says, when Moses ascended on high, he found the Holy One, blessed be he, sitting and tying crowns on the letters of the Torah. In other words, God was up in heaven or wherever God was, and God was, that if you look at a Torah scroll, you see that the Torah is written with these flourishes, and these are the crowns that are put on the Torah. And God was obviously the first. So he's sitting and tying crowns on the letters of the Torah. Moses said before God, Master of the universe, who is preventing you from giving the Torah without these additions? God said to him, so in other words, Moses is saying, why do you need to do this? God said to him, there's a man who is destined to be born after several generations. And Akiva ben Yosef is his name. Rabbi Akiva is his name. He is destined to derive from each and every thorn of these crowns, mounds upon mounds of halachot, like insights and laws that Akiva is going to come up with. For every single one of these little flourishes in the Torah, Akiva is going to have an insight or a law about it. It is for his sake that the crowns must be added to the letters of the Torah, right? So basically what you have is God is having a conversation with Moses about Rabbi Akiva, who is going to come 2,000 years later or 1,500 years later. So it continues. Moses said before God, Master of the universe, show him to me. God said to him, return behind you. And Moses went and sat at the end of the 8th row in Rabbi Akiva's study hall and did not understand what they were saying. So imagine this, Moses, the great Moses of all people, he is magically transported 1,500 years into the future, and he is sitting in Rabbi Akiva's class. And Moses is like, I don't understand a word he's saying. It's not that it's spoken in a different language. It's like he's talking about mixing chicken and milk. There was no such thing in the Torah about, chicken and milk. And, he's saying, you're not allowed to do this. This is what you have to do for a Jewish wedding. There's nothing in the Torah about Jewish weddings. Like, how? I don't understand a word they're saying. Moses' strength waned as he thought his Torah knowledge was deficient. He's like, I must be like, he got exhausted because he realized that he just doesn't know anything. or nothing compared to Akiva. And when Rabbi Akiva arrived at the discussion of one matter, his students said to him, "My teacher, from where do you derive this?" And Rabbi Akiva said to them, "It is a halakha, it's a law transmitted to Moses from Sinai." In other words, you can't find this anywhere, but I know that this was something that God told Moses. And when Moses heard this, his mind was put at ease, as this too was part of the Torah that he was to receive. In other words, Moses realized, in fact, that Akiva was still using the foundation of what happened in the Torah, and was still using the Torah that was written and given on Mount Sinai, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, etc. And that was still the core of this, of what would become the rabbinic tradition. And for that reason, Moses was put at ease knowing that the way that the rabbis were functioning was indeed loyal to the traditions of our past. And so that's an important story from the Talmud for them to be able to justify the fact that they, wrote all of these laws that weren't necessarily in the Torah. So Pirkei Avot.
Could I jump in for
Yeah,
a moment?
Yeah, be my guest.
This is the passage about the many disciples, building many disciples, is a part of the democratic tradition of the Jewish community. That's how Spinoza saw it as well.
Yes.
And
Absolutely.
in addition, of course, this is like constitutional interpretation, the way the Supreme Court looks at the Constitution, even though not all provisions that we govern our laws today are in the Constitution. They say, well, this was meant by the founding fathers.
Right. That is exactly correct.
Yeah.
That is exactly correct. That's what those who wrote, the authors of the Constitution meant. That's what, yes, absolutely. Tom.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
The first of the three things, be patient in the administration of justice. I mean, that
Yep.
seems wise and prudent, but for that to be the very first thing, the prominence that it receives here, in the very first tractate or first part of the first tractate, is it known what was going on that would make that idea so important?
Well, yes and no. No, I don't know what was going on to make that idea so important. If it were to be understood in terms of justice, like courtroom justice. However, if it's understood to be justice in terms of Jewish legal justice, then it makes sense that they would say, take your time with this. Let's not jump the gun. Let's not make assumptions about what Jewish law is. We've got a lot of people, and these laws need to be discussed. And they need to be given the proper time to be churned. And in fact, we'll get to it. I'm not going to quote it. Well, I mean, I'll quote it, but I'm not going to show it to you because it's a later one of our chapters. But it talks about how our obligation is to turn it over and turn it over again and turn it over again until we're constantly looking at it from all the different sides and angles, and we're able to say, look, we've really exhausted our time in studying and thinking about this Jewish principle. And so I think being patient in the administration of justice, it's not just about civil legalities, but rather it's really a lot about Jewish stuff, Jewish laws, and making sure that we are being patient and thoughtful in the way that we make decisions about issues that come up with respect to Jewish law. Are there any other thoughts?
Rabbi?
Yes, sorry.
Okay, first of all, thank you for mentioning that the difference between the written Torah and the Torah Shebe'al Peh, the oral Torah. In Israel, I think that until today, and it's not just Orthodox, it's in every high school, beginning the first year, you begin to learn the Mishnah, Pirkei Avot, and it's called Torah Shebe'al Peh, the oral Torah. Now, this first chapter is the first chapter of the Torah Shebe'al Peh, and it says that Moses received the Torah and he transmitted it to different generations. First of all, there is a difference between receiving and transmitting. And along the generations, when you are transmitting something, always the second generation, the third generation is omitting or adding different facts. As I see it, when it came to the Anshei Knesset Agdola, the men of the Great Assembly, and by the way, this is based on this group, Anshei Knesset Agdola, the Israeli Knesset. This is the Anshei Knesset Agdola, the compound of 120 members. And this is the source, this based on this Anshei Knesset Agdola. So when it came to the Anshei Knesset Agdola, the legislative group, they chose to emphasize the first things that the world consists, be patient in the injustice, because along the years, along the generations, people maybe were confused or added to the law, decreased from the law, and they wanted to make sure that you are, like Eleanor said, investigate and making the right judgment.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else?
I'd like to say something.
Go ahead.
In the background, because Tom was asking about that, we might try to remember that Israel was under occupation, the Romans, and before that, the Greeks, I guess. And I guess the soldiers could mete out punishment without any kind of investigation. So that may have made these people think about,
right.
You need to take time before you kill somebody.
Right, except, yes, but I don't think it's talking about, it's making a statement to other people, to anyone who is, like, I don't think they're expecting the Romans to be reading this, unless they're saying, they are saying, look, they're saying to the Romans, these are our values. But I don't think that there's any, but I don't think that this is a request of other people. Rather, I think it's a request or a communication about the way that we operate amongst ourselves. Any other thoughts or questions? We got 5 minutes. So maybe we'll do is whet our appetite for the next time. And we'll read the second one. And after reading it, we'll just kind of let you I'll give you maybe a little background to it, but we won't go into it too deeply. And for the next week, we'll be able to talk about it more. So the next one says, Shimon the Righteous was one of the last men of the Great Assembly. That same Great Assembly we're talking about. He used to say, the world stands upon 3 things: the Torah, the temple service, and the practice of acts of piety. You might know this. If I read to you the Hebrew, I'll bet you some of you probably know it. Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Righteous. Haya Mishyarei Knesset Hagdolah. He was one of the final members of the Great Assembly. Hu Haya Omer, he would say, Al Shlosha Devarim Ha'olam Omed. On three things does this world stand: Al HaTorah, V'al HaAvodah, V'al Gimilut Chasadim. The reason why you may be familiar with that, because there's a song, Al Shlosha Devarim, Al HaTorah, V'al HaAvodah, V'al Gimilut Chasadim. So this is where it comes from. And let me just give you a little bit of a nugget, and then we'll call it. And that is to say that Shimon the Righteous, he was one of the last members, admittedly, of the Great Assembly, or the last member of the Great Assembly. But more importantly, he was a priest. Okay, so you have a priest, and he was known as a priest. You have a priest who is making this claim that the world stands upon three things: the Torah, the temple service, and the practice of acts of piety. And so maybe I'll leave it there for you to think about for the next time. And I'll probably also next time send you the materials that when I screen share with the other comments. I'll send you these materials for next class also, or it'll be in the email.
Yes, please.
What's that?
Rabbi, one thing, I do not understand why the translation is temple service when it's avodah in general. Well, it doesn't say avodat Hashem or avodat Adonai. So I see it.
You are right.
And the song is talking about the work, the avodah in general. So
Well, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure about that. So we will explore that. Okay. But your question is the right one, or your point that you're bringing up is the right one. But I'm not so sure. So it'll be fun for us to talk about it next week. Okay. But anyway, Shimon the Righteous was a priest. And so his what he says and what he does needs to be at least taken into consideration, the backdrop of the fact of who he was and what he did. Hey, I really appreciate it. I will look forward to seeing everyone next week also. And thank you for being part of this with me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
If you didn't put your name in the chat, please do so.
Sei gesund und stark.
Type your name in the chat.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you, Jim.
Are you still recording this?
Yep. I'm going to stop recording it.
Okay.